Hey guys, welcome to another exciting video in our journey with ASP.NET MVC web development. Today we will be looking into adding validations to our forms. Now, validations are very important because when we are accepting input from a user, trying to store it in our database, we want to ensure that whatever we're passing over to the database meets certain rules at the very least. A rule can be like, you expect a text value for a text field, or you expect a number value for a number field, or your text value should be at a certain length, those kinds of things. Those are validations that we want to ensure we do from the client side, meaning we don't want it to try and hit the database with invalid data before we know if this data is admissible or not. So we want to add certain rules to our forms such that before the user is able to actually submit this information, we can ensure that everything matches a certain standard. Now, to kick things off, we'll take a look at our create action in our courses controller. As you can see, I'm already in debug mode, but we want to take a look at what happens when we submit data. So we have our create action, which renders our form for create courses. So I'm just going to bring that up quickly. We click on courses, and then we click create new, which then renders our create view. And then we ask the user, what is the title of this course and how many credits should it be? This is a number, right? But I shouldn't be able to put in text. Those kinds of things matter when you want to validate the information coming back. If you take a look at what happens upon the post, you see that it checks if model state is valid, which means it is assessing all of the information that it just got from the user and saying, is this information valid? Now, what we're going to do in this video is set up our own set of validations so that this automatically assesses our rules and makes a decision based on that. But before we do that, we're going to take a look at the database, and we're going to take a look at what happens when we try to submit information. If we take a look at the course table, which I already have over here, and look at the designer, we will see that both title and credits columns are designed to allow null values, which in fairness is probably not the best thing to do, because then it allows me to create a course with no title and no credits, which doesn't really make sense. It hits my breakpoint and I'll just continue, and it goes ahead and it actually creates that empty record with a null value for title and a null value for credits, and there's nothing there, which is something that we really do not want a user to be able to do. So the first step would be to change the validation rules or change the data type rules on our database. So we can head back over to Visual Studio, bring up our designer for our course database, and we say we want to not allow nulls. So we untick those allow nulls, and then we can click update. Then we say update database. This is going to give us an error, as you see down here, because then we're setting our database to not accept nulls while we have null values that exist. So I'm just going to remove that null record. And since I have my CRUD operation, I'll just do it here since my code works. So I'll delete this null record. And I want to delete it. And once again, we hit a breakpoint. I'm just going to continue, and there it is removed. So now we can retry our save. So I click update and update again, and then it is successful this time. Now let us try and add a course with no title and no credits once again. So we are going to leave these blank because we want to test if changing the null setting and the rules that govern our data types in our database will be effective enough in setting up validations here. So when we click create, we see that it actually hits an error. It hits an exception saying that something happened while trying to execute this. And if we scroll down and read the details, it says that we cannot insert a null value into the column title. So we see that some amount of validation is actually occurring here, but this is probably not the best because you don't want your application to actually pause like this when a user is using it, or give these kinds of errors that a user may not necessarily understand. So if I click continue, then you'll see that the page proceeds to load a very nasty looking error that the typical user may not necessarily know how to process and may not want to see at all. So we're going to have to modify this behavior a bit. So I'm going to quickly exit debug mode, and then we will get to work. Now, in order to actually add these validation rules, we have to use some C# classes and enact some OOP type implementations to have a very fluid and somewhat disjointed but unified solution. And that sounds like a paradox, but as I go through it, you'll appreciate what I'm saying. So the first thing we want to do is to take a look at our model. So we said that we want to start adding validations to our courses. So we drill down into our models folder, into our EDMX diagram, and then we drill down into our model.tt and look at our course class. We need to appreciate what is here, and do recall that each field that is outlined here is synonymous with what is in the database. So the fact that we see here that credits is still a nullable value means that we updated our database, but we did not update our models. So that is the first step we need to take. So we go to our EDMX diagram, and then we right click in the open space and click update from database. We go to refresh, click tables, and click finish. This then reloads our tables, and since the last time we were here, I added middle name and date of birth to our student class. Now do remember that each time we refresh or do make a change of any sort to our diagram, we need to build. So you can either go to build and click build solution, or hold down Ctrl Shift and B, and that will actually effect a build operation. So I'm going to do that, Ctrl Shift and B, and mine is already built. So when we go to our course.cs file, we will see that it is updated to show that it is no longer a nullable value. It has to have an int, and it has to have a string, and it has to have an integer here. So you can see that this change has been made successfully. So that is step one of our validation, making sure that our database reflects our ambitions. Step two to our validation is to create what we call metadata classes. All right, if you've done database, that we have what you call metadata, which is pretty much data about data. So in this case, we have data in the form of our model or our class or our database tables, and the data about that would be descriptions that we want, and in this case the descriptions we want would be our validation rules. Okay, so what we want to do at this juncture is to create some classes that will describe rules that will govern our values here. Now, since the work we're about to do concerns models, then the best place to go ahead and create the files that we need would be in the models folder. But then if you look in the models folder, you see that you already have a kind of variety. At least if you created the project in the way that I did with the individual user account set up at the start, then you would have these view models already existing. So in order to not mix and maintain that separation of concerns, I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it meta classes. And then inside meta classes, then I will have those metadata classes that I alluded to just now. The first one I'll create, of course, is one for courses. So I'll right click, click add, create a class, and I will call this one courses metadata. Click add. And then that will give me this empty class. Now, my first objective is to make this empty class mirror my actual model. So I can go back to my course.cs file and find all of these properties that are there for me. I don't have to I don't have to validate course ID, because upon creation or edit or any operation, we don't need to validate what the value is here. But we may want to restrict any course title to a length of 50, and we wouldn't want people putting in 50 credits for any course that they're creating. Maybe the maximum number of credits that any course can be is 8. So we're just going to copy these two over, put them in our metadata class, and then proceed to add our validations. Before we move on, in order to add our validations, or what we call data annotations, we have to include our library that gives us that function. So we'll say using system dot component model dot data annotations. Now, you may not remember this, but then when you see the pattern that I'm about to use, Visual Studio will actually recognize this pattern and say to you that, hey, this is illegal. You have to include this library to use this. And then they would proceed to suggest that you include that library. So like I said, the first thing I want to do is include a string length of 50. So literally, I'm going to say string length, and there IntelliSense finishes it for us. And I'm going to say 50. Now, if I remove this and notice that it has now come to life, everybody else is somewhat grayed out, but this one is actually bold white text. If I removed this, then typing this would cause an error in Visual Studio, and then they would suggest to me that I need that library. So you can always start typing it before and then include the library retroactively, or you can just include this library and then you have no problem moving forward. I also said that for my integer, I want to restrict the range of values to be from 1. So that means you can't have a course with 0 credits, and it should never pass 8. Now, it is worthy of note that you can actually include these directly on your course.cs. So you didn't have to necessarily go and create a whole new file, a whole new folder, and a whole new file, and then start from scratch and put those there. You could actually put them right here above title and above credits. The downside to this, however, is that each time the model gets generated or regenerated or updated or changed and you build your project, then you're actually going to have this CS file as well as every other one listed here refreshed. So any changes that you made to it will be discarded. So you really don't want to do that, because that would lead to a lot of rework and you have to do this each time. So I am suggesting that you create this new file and then you associate it with that model using a partial class. And that way you will have that, as I said, disjointed because they're actually different files, but unified because they're making reference to each other. So it doesn't matter what happens here. Even if the courses table ceases to exist, this courses and metadata courses table will not in any way encroach on the operation of your system. So next, we're going to create actually another class, and in C# you can actually use one CS file to house many classes. Some people say it's bad practice, some people practice it. It's up to you. You can decide what you want to do. I'm just going to use this one CS class called courses metadata, and I'm just going to create another public class, but this one will be partial. So public partial class, and I'm going to give it the same name as the model that I want it to be associated with. So that's one of those great OOP tricks where I can create, the name of the class is course. I can create a partial class and give it some properties, and it will work in conjunction with the original class. What I want it to do, however, is be associated with the metadata class. So I'll use another data annotation, and I'll say meta data type, and this is some fancy C# that's going to happen here, but you can study this pattern or just know how to do it when the time is right. So I want to associate it with courses metadata. So at the end of this exercise, you would have created a metadata class, which would have data annotations that will govern the validations of your fields, and you would have associated it with the class coming from your model, just in a very indirect and OOP-like way. Now, one final change before we move on, and this is very, very, very important, and it's a common mistake that people will run into trying to maintain that separation of concerns, but the partial class that you define needs to be in the same namespace as the class it is, well, let's say a part of. So if I go to courses and I look at the namespace, I'll see that it is in schoolmanagement.models. If we look at where the namespace is for the partial class, we'll see that it is in models.metaclasses. So each folder determines that namespace hierarchy, right? So we're coming from the project school management to a folder called models, so school management, to a folder called models, to another folder called metaclasses, and that is its namespace. So what we want to do is remove the metaclasses from the namespace. We can leave it physically in the folder, but the namespace will associate it with this folder and any other file in that folder. So by doing so, we are putting our partial class on parity in the hierarchical sense with its original counterparts. So we can go ahead and actually debug and see if our validation works. Alright guys, so we will look at the courses section and just run some tests to see if our validations are working. So we go to create new, and then firstly we're going to just click create. So what the expectation is that once invalid data is being sent across, it will rebuff our attempt to create a record and display an error message. So we click create, and without filling anything in, we see that the page just reloads with an error message. The credits field is required. Now, if we can quickly review where that error message is coming from, I'm bringing up Visual Studio still in debug mode, and I am just going to go over to our view for create and courses, and then we can just take a look at what is happening in that credits section of the form. So remember, we have that label, which gives us the word credits, and then we have the edit, which gives us our text box. But then right underneath that, we actually have an HTML helper that is sending back a validation message. All right. And we see that the Bootstrap class text-danger is being applied. So that is basically saying that once I try to submit, and I'm just going to go to my controller real quickly and put a breakpoint right at this decision. So I hit create and it hits that breakpoint, and then it evaluates if the model state is valid, and you'll see that this is evaluating to false, unlike all the other times in the previous examples where it validated and went to true. So if this validates to true, then that should happen. The fact that it goes to false means that it will just return the same view, which is our create view, and it will return whatever data was being submitted. And we know that we didn't try to submit anything, so everything comes back as null and 0. And then that is what triggers the display of our validation message. So if I put in a title, and you can see that I was testing this thing, so I put in a title with clearly more than 50 H's, and do recall that our validation rule for courses says that we should only accept 50 or up to 50. So if I click create, it hits it again, and it says that the state is not valid. So it returns the view with the data, and we see we get back our data alongside a displayed error message that we're exceeding our maximum length. If I say a 10 credit course, once again, recall that our validation rule said 1 to 8. So that means anything less than 1 and anything more than 8 will trigger an error message. So if I click create, once again, it hits our breakpoint. The model validity is false. So we click continue, and it will display an appropriate error message displaying to the user, hey, your data is wrong for this reason. And so this is a pretty cool feature that we can use to ensure that our users are staying within the confines of what we expect for our data. So I can create a legitimate course, ASP.NET MVC validation, and that could be a 1 credit course. And then I click create, and then we see it hits our breakpoint, and this time everything is valid. And because it is valid, it will go ahead and add it and save the changes and then redirect to our listing of courses. So I press continue. The expectation is fulfilled. There we have our brand new course. So that is how you can go about setting validations on your fields. Now, data annotations actually serve a greater purpose than just setting validation rules. They can actually influence what is displayed for a form or for a value in that display name for helper function. So I'm just going to jump over to Visual Studio real quickly and show you what I mean. Do recall that we have label for, and then in our details view, we do have display name for. So you can actually use data annotation to influence these. The simple way to change this would be to erase it and rewrite what you want. The downside to that is if the field changes or something about what should be displayed changes and you have it set at different points of your project, then you're going to have to manually go through and change it at all those points, which can be tedious. If you, however, continue to use the HTML function and then you use your data annotation, then once you make the change in the data annotation, it will be made right across your application. So just as a quick example, for our courses form, we have title and credits, just like the fields are in our database, right? Title and credits. So as they appear in our database, that's how they get created in our model. Title, credits, and that is what will be displayed in our label for on our page, title and credits. If we go to details, we'll see title and credits. Now, it seems innocent and it seems unimportant for courses because we only have one word. But what about the case of students where we're actually collecting first name, last name, enrollment date, and other things? So you can see here that last name is appearing as it does in the database with no space, no discernible space here for human readability. If we click details, we see everything about the student, and once again, this is not very human readable or friendly. Now, when we go to students, unlike courses, we don't have only one word, but we have two words. So we click on students and we see that we have last name, first name, and enrollment dates with no discernible space in between these names and labels, and that is not very user friendly. That's not good. We want to make sure that our users look at our screen and feel comfortable absorbing and digesting our information. If I go to details, you see it is a very similar situation. So we're going to have to use some data annotation to clean this up and make our students much more user-friendly to when we're reading the information. So back in Visual Studio, what we want to do is create two classes to associate with students, one for our metadata and one for our partial class. And do recall that I created this folder here, meta classes, for our metadata, but we subsequently need to change the namespace so that everything flows smoothly. So I'm going to right click, add, go to class, and we're creating student metadata. And then the easy way to go about doing this is just to copy all of the fields that are coming back from our original model in our database. So we drill down into the EDMX file, we find students.cs, and then we can copy across all of these. Do note once again that these things are nullable, so for your own purpose, you may go ahead and change the database, update your model, but I really just need to get the data annotations here for student metadata. So I copy those across, and we want to run some custom labels for all of these database fields. Now the first one I'm going to do is last name, and I'm going to say string length. And I'm just going to set up a validation. I don't want anybody entering a string length of more than 50 for a last name. So I'm setting up a validation right here. And you see the arrow is being displayed, and Visual Studio is telling me I need to include this library in order to use this function. Secondly, I want to say that the display needs to have a name, and I'm going to set a custom string. And you can always pay attention to the tooltips. They're always guiding you as to what values can go in. We want name, which is what is going to be displayed in the UI. You can just read that description and ascertain what it is. And I want to display in the UI last space name. All right, so we're moving away from last name as one perceivable word to two words. And I can just reuse these annotations for the first name. I don't want more than 50. And first name, just put some space to make it look more readable. Enrollment date. Well, I don't need to specify a length because a date is a date, right? The data type is already set. It's allowed as null anyway. And I want to display enrollment date with a space. Or better yet, let's change it up a bit. Date of enrollment. So I'm rewording it just to show you that it's not a matter of, just putting a space in here. You can label it whatever you want on your form. All right. And let me just do the same for middle name. So middle name, I'm limiting the number of characters, setting up middle space name, and date of birth would have similar rules for enrollment date since they're both dates anyway. So I'll just say date of birth. And then the second step of this entire transformation process is to create a public class, public partial class, and call it student, and associate the metadata class with it. And you can look back at the previous code, but I'm just going to type it here, metadata type, and then in bracket we say type of, and then we spell out that it should be of type student metadata. And as our final act, which probably could have come first anyway, we want to make sure that our namespace is the same as the namespace for our partial target class. And then having done all of this, we can go ahead and continue with our development or in debug and see if everything clicks. Now, when our students page loads, you can start seeing the differences already. You see that discernible space between last and name, first and name, date of enrollment. So the labels have changed. If we go to create new, we'll see that the labels for the form have changed. The middle name, date of enrollment. We haven't included the date of birth on the create page as yet. Details. So everywhere that is dynamically using that HTML helper that we pointed out is in details, display name for, or in the create, we have label for, or in our index we have display name for. Everywhere that you have something like that, by setting up our data annotations and setting up our meta class, we will see the different labels that we set being displayed for our users. And that is indeed and in fact how you go about customizing what is displayed without being too intrusive, and by leveraging the flexibility that this framework gives you.